Welcome back to the Wednesday night Bible study. We're on our fourth installment of the story of David, found in 1 Samuel. And last week, in 1 Samuel chapter 17, we got ourselves ready to read about a battle, one between a teenage shepherd boy, David, and a huge Philistine named Goliath. So King Saul had serious revelations in letting this inexperienced boy take on the giant, but David convinced him. Let's read in 1 Samuel 17:36. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. So as we said, David has faith. He has confidence. He knows God is no match for Goliath. Actually, Goliath is no match for God. And I can imagine that Saul's relieved that he doesn't have to face Goliath himself. So let's continue the story in verse 38. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. I want you to remember that he's a very tall man, the king, King Saul. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I am not used to them. So he took them off. So Saul tries to suit David up. Not in the best way, but in the best way he knew how. If it wasn't so serious of a thing David was about to face, it'd kind of be funny. Imagine this smallish David in a very big man's armor. It wouldn't have worked very well for him. There's also another motive to consider that Saul was considering, a selfish one. You could say that Saul wanted to give David every advantage, and that's probably true, but according to a commentator named Ronald Youngblood, Saul was also good at finding advantages for himself. It was believed that to wear the clothing of another was to be imbued with his essence and to share his very being. These latter acts were probably calculated to so bind Saul to David that Saul would be able to take credit for, or at least to share in, David's victory over the Philistine giant. Okay, so it seems like a good idea that David takes off the armor. In verse 40, then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. So armed with a sling, some rocks, and a stick, David was ready. I don't know if you've read other folks talking about this, but this really, what David was good at. Slingshot. Probably is what he used against like the bear and the lion out in the shepherding world. So there's a lesson here too. When we face our giants, it's not best to meet them in someone else's strength. What I mean is that what works for them may not work for us. So having the king's armor and using what the king would use wouldn't necessarily work for David. We have to be who we are. Okay, in verse 40 then, I guess 41. Meanwhile, the Philistine, that'd be Goliath, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was only a boy, ruddy and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Continuing on, David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. That statement, the battle is the Lord's. For me, this is the most important statement in the story. This was the perspective in David's whole life. This is the best perspective for all of us to have. The battle is the Lord's. We all face giants in our lives. If you think about it, what are some giants we face? What might come to mind for you is health issues, finances, relationships, loneliness, mistreatment, fear, discouragement, guilt. But the battle is the Lord's, not ours. Our part in the battle is to trust the Lord, to trust his power like David did. And continuing with the story, as the Philistine, Goliath, moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So it looks like David is getting the upper hand here. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the scabbard. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Shaaraim road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem, and he put the Philistines' weapons in his own tent. Verse 55, as Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of the army, Abner, whose son is that young man? Abner replied, as surely as you live, O king, I don't know. The king said, find out whose son this young man is. As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. Whose son are you, young man? Saul asked him. David said, I am the son of your servant, Jesse of Bethlehem. So, of course, Saul knew who David was. I mean, he had been his armor bearer. He had been his musician. But Saul didn't remember David's father's name. And that's not surprising. I mean, the king's got other things on his mind. And neither did Abner remember Jesse or even remember Jesse and even David were nobodies until he got into the king's service. So why does Saul suddenly care about who David's father is? Well, there's first the promise of exempting the hero's household from taxes, but more importantly, wouldn't maybe David make a good bodyguard or a leader, someone in his army ranks? But either job would require the father's permission. He was still a boy. Sounds like Saul has plans for David. We'll find it out if they coincide with God's plans. So that concludes that event in David's life. David was victorious over Goliath. Was it now time for him to take over as king? No. There would be years of trouble first. Killing the giant was a great achievement, beating an opponent. But we'll see later that David will find an even more dangerous opponent. So stay tuned till next time. In the meantime, take care, be safe, and may the Lord be with you.